You're tuned into the Unnecessary Harm podcast, where we drill down on issues of substance use and its cultural impact. Your host, Shane Varcoe, Executive Director of the Delgado Institute, with over 40 years' experience in youth and community work and a passion for building resilience.
Welcome back to the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Good to have you with us again. For those chiming in for the first time, welcome on board. Good to have you here. The utterly unnecessary harm of the opioid addiction crisis that has plagued the US for well over a decade has killed more Americans than World War II, Vietnam and Korean wars combined. According to the CDC data, it is well over 600,000 and has been a leading cause of death amongst young Americans 18 to 25 in recent years, with over 107,000 drug poisoning deaths in 2021 alone, and 3/4 of those attributed to opioids. But the disturbing statistics don't end there. This crisis has been, if not the sole, then very close to it, contributor to the largest drop in life expectancy in the US in recent history. Yep, you can't make this stuff up. First World West, with all the potentials for longevity in play, but seeing that longevity eroded by substance use. Behind this shocking data is a story, and whilst not complex, it is convoluted, and a plethora of docs and movies have been made, and many of you have seen those. But today's guest was one of the very first to investigate this shocking seismic cultural phenomenon, who has spelunked the mess and brought forth some important gems of understanding. He's a storyteller of staggering scope, a journalist who's mapped out this crisis most affecting US families, towns and futures. Many of you will know him from his work as the author of Dreamland, a groundbreaking book that pieced together the perfect storm that gave rise. I'll say that again. So just cut that out there, Vic. So we'll just do that one again. He is a storyteller of staggering scope, a journalist who's mapped out the crisis most affecting US families, towns and futures. Many of you will know him by his work as the author of Dreamland, a groundbreaking book that Sorry, Sam. I'll get it right in a minute.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's all good. If we can fix it at the start, we fix it now. That's what we do.
That's all right.
Okay, here we go. He is a storyteller of staggering scope, a journalist who's mapped out the crisis most affecting US families, towns and futures. Many of you will know him by his work as the author of Dreamland, a groundbreaking book that pieced together the perfect storm that gave rise to Americans' opioid crisis and epidemic. From corporate greed, ruthless street-dealing entrepreneurs, to black tar heroin, to the breakdown of community itself. His follow-up work, The Least of Us, is equally haunting and hopeful, revealing how fentanyl and meth are reshaping lives and how people across the country are quietly fighting back. He's not just reporting on addiction, he has unfurled, in great part to us, the human cost of disconnection and the surprising places where healing begins. Sam Quinones, a very, very special welcome to the Unnecessary Harm podcast.
Well, Shane, thank you very, very much for that very nice introduction. I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, look, it's half the story. And again, if we spent most time looking at your CV, my friend, we'd be here for another 20 minutes. But we're grateful for you to chime in. And look, particularly for those of us down under, and there are many listening to this that have read your work or be certainly across the opioid crisis in America. And it's starting to creep into our space down here in Australia and in the Southern Hemisphere. It's not anywhere near what it is in the States, but it is there. And, of course, the fentanyl issue is now becoming a problem, and nitazines and all the variants that are starting to emerge are starting to find their way into our isolated continent. But it is getting here. But no, thanks for coming in today. Look, before we drill down into this vast topic, and it is a vast topic, be good to get a little bit of a background of who you are. And I just just a few things without going into too much depth. But you're a graduate of UCLA Berkeley with a BA in both American history and economics, correct?
Long ago. Yes, sir.
But it's an important reason I bring that up. It's an important combo. A lot of people, and I'm a great student of history. I'm a big fan of history, and in fact, it is one of the key cornerstones for anything that's functional in cultural development. And a lot of people don't realise that. And so when you've got a combined combo, I like your mix, economics and history. I think that's a very powerful combo. At LA Times journalist, you still with them, or you now freelance?
I'm a freelance writer now. I mean, I've worked for 4 newspapers
Correct.
The beginnings of my career really kind of were at a small paper in Central Valley of California, where I was a crime reporter, and that's where I first saw black tar heroin. I did not know what black tar heroin was. I also covered crack cocaine at that time. It was a very serious problem in many parts of the United States. This was the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
And also, I got acquainted with methamphetamine at that point too, because there was a section of town where people were making it as well. So that was kind of my formative period, 1988 to 1992, as a crime reporter.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the fact that you're a crime reporter dealing with this emerging epidemic gives you a unique insight, which we'll kind of spend some time on that a bit later on. But the question I want to ask, and I think for our listeners to get a handle on this, when did you land on the very effective narrative genre of recording, reporting, and revealing? It's something that you do well. And I've not read both your books in complete, but I've obviously thumbed through them, and I've read significant parts of it. Yeah. Exceptional books. So when did you land on that? Or was that something that sort of just evolved, or did you go, this works?
Yeah, I mean, I think it started with Dreamland. The Dreamland book, I first of all, I approached the book as a journalist entirely, and I wanted to write stories about people, and it was so there was my bibliography on that book was very short. Really, it was mostly interviews and repeated interviews.
Correct.
But along the way, what I realized was that books about heroin did not sell. No one read them. And I realized this from looking at sales data. I got a bunch of books out of the library, bought them. And I thought to myself, I do not want my book to be one of those. And one of the things that a lot of those books had in common was very long, what I would consider to be thick chapters. And I began to think, why do at the time I was binging certain TV shows. The Wire is one. I'm not sure if you knew that's one down in Australia. Yep. Magnificent piece of storytelling there. And some others. And I began to realize that what they did in those shows was tell several stories at once. So there's these threads of stories. And they would leave you hanging like any good storyteller would, right? Yep. And also the storytelling, it was like each story was brought along in small chunks. And so I just began to conceive of that book, and then The Least of Us was similar.
Yes.
As a book version of one of those great new television shows that people were binging, and I myself binged. And in time, so I began to write the stories out, but then divide them up into smaller chunks. And it had the other benefit, though, of making a story about a very dour, depressing topic, which is drug addiction and opioid addiction and heroin addiction especially, into something that was engaging and grabbed people. And I know this, trying not to be immodest on this, but I mean, I know this from people writing to me and telling me, I read your book over the weekend, a second time or third. Like one guy said, this is the third time I read the thing, And I felt that was important because the topic of heroin addiction is not one that people will naturally gravitate towards.
Correct.
So you have to find storytelling mechanisms to make people want to stay with it. And a lot of that, of course, has to do, essential in that, is developing characters, people whose lives were affected in some way or another, or were part of the sales team or whatever. And so the story vehicle, the storytelling mechanism that I used was really brought upon because I needed a way of making heroin into something that people would read all the way through. And I didn't know if it worked, but once it did when the book came out, I began getting emails that told, and then I would speak I spoke hundreds of times across America in the next several years. Imagine. It was really remarkable, the number of speaking engagements I got. And I would hear this all the time. It was constant. So I have this very good confidence that the technique worked by simply making the chapters short, leaving people hanging, one chapter on one topic and then several chapters, and you get back to that topic 3 or 4 chapters
perfect.
later, that kind of thing, leaving people hanging. It's an old technique. Charles Dickens did it.
Yep.
Lots of serials have done that. It wasn't me that invented it, but it definitely worked for the book.
No, absolutely. And I think pathos, when it's layered and woven, is really, really powerful. And that's what you've done in the work. And it's not just about grabbing, the attention. It's about creating a hunger to find out not just, what happens next, which, it's a good thriller, but it's like, where did this go? And why did it go there? I really need to understand this. And I think that's where the journalism with the pathos weaving and layering is really, really powerful.
And you know what I was really, the people I was, it's very important as a writer to have some kind of audience you have in mind, imagining an audience. And it was really for parents of people who had lost loved ones, children mostly. And because so many people didn't understand what had happened, part of the reason for that was that so many people, once they had an addicted loved one, first to the prescription opioid painkiller pills prescribed by doctors, and then to heroin, most of those folks did not want to share that information. They would tell nobody. Their loved one would die, but they wouldn't say anything about how that happened. And so there was this national conspiracy of silence, in a sense, and that was part of who I was writing for, because so many people were in the dark, almost literally, on this topic. And they didn't know what had happened to their lives. And how did this happen? How did my son get addicted to heroin, which was, most of their parents were of a generation of my own. We viewed heroin as the worst drug you could possibly do. Nobody I knew did heroin. A lot of other drugs, but not heroin. And I think that was kind of the, that's what kind of, people were feeling. And then once you tell a story with that in mind, of telling the whole story, the comprehensive story about how this all happened, that's when people people began to rush out of the shadows at that point.
Perfect.
It was a remarkable thing to watch after the book came out. Within a couple of years, 3 years, I began to see that without a question.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the powerful aspects of this particular genre of writing. It is about truth-telling that actually engages with a person's heartbeat. And it's, again, not emotionally manipulative. And this is one of the things, we bounce out of a lot of different spaces when it comes to literature, because we have to write and we have to research. But you look at the manipulative stuff and you go, I get it, the tug at the heartstrings. But when, as I said, the conspiracy of silence, I think that's a very powerful statement. And it's not just about the bad actors trying to keep a lid on things. It's about shame, and it's about fear, and it's about this complete deep sense of what the hell happened here, as you've indicated. Exactly. And I think that unanswered question, it shines a light of, it's maybe not intentionally done so, but it shines a light onto the psyche of the person asking that question, because it says, I've missed something. I'm deficient. I didn't see this. What's wrong with me? And that insecurity that mounts also creates this sense of, I can't speak to this because I clearly didn't know what was happening, which also adds another layer to the silence and another layer to disempowerment. And that's where Dreamland, and The Least of Us, I think that's a great title too, really says to people, it's okay to talk about this. Right. It's not about trying to find answers necessarily or become an authority on this or to excuse yourself. It's like, wow, there's a lot of factors in play here. And
I totally believe that. Yeah, that's kind of what happened along the way. And it was my own awakening to this topic too. I got into it not because I had any connection to opioid addiction. I had none. No. But I saw this as this huge, huge national story that no one had told holistically, comprehensively, from the point of view of the heroin traffickers, from the point of view of the pain doctors prescribing these pills, from the point of view of communities that were just totally ravaged by this and lost almost an entire generation, sometimes two, to it, And so it was part of it was my own awakening to understanding the breadth of the story. And then also the idea, I had come, my experience writing about drugs had really been centered in the crack epidemic. And in the United States during the 80s and 90s, the crack epidemic was not something you could hide. It was on the streets. Guys were selling crack like rows of dealers. You'd see them in the town where I was. I saw this several times, but also it was the violence that came with crack. It was gun battles, drive-by shootings, carjackings, all that. And so no one could say, no, I don't know this is happening.
You can't plead ignorance. Yeah.
No, but with the opioid epidemic, because doctors were the ones prescribing the drugs, because people believed the doctors and believed the drug companies, and many people got hooked in ways that they blamed themselves for.
Yes.
There was there was no gun play. It was prescribed by doctors in white coats and linoleum floors and clinics and stuff. And so there wasn't the violence, there wasn't the outrage. And so people just kind of didn't understand the full story, and they so often blame themselves excessively, I think, in many cases, for what had happened to their loved one or to their street or to their community.
Well, that's the beauty of the illicit transformation of a illicit substance. And that's the key issue here. We're seeing that now start with cannabis. We're starting to see that become, it's a medicine. It's okay. Let's everyone's on it. It's good for you. It can't hurt you. It's not that bad. And we're having a similar response here. But it's interesting. You're right. Once you've got again, look, people, Sam, you'll experience this yourself. People will have confirmation biases. We hear what we want to hear. And if we have a felt need met with an immediacy that suits us, then we look for a narrative that's going to back that. And the White Coat Brigade, the pharmaceuticals are supplying this. It was nicknamed in the 90s, I think, hillbilly heroin at one stage, oxycodone and all that sort of stuff. Hillbilly heroin, you crush it up, shoot it up, snort it, do whatever you want. But again, but it's medicine. And we're just retasking medicine. Now, what could go wrong? What could go wrong with that? And then, of course, then you start graduating because opioids, and now we're seeing these graduates, like you said, the black tar heroin, and we moved on. Now, I wanted to ask you about your background again in this space of the emerging awareness of things. You did move down to Mexico to do some writing. Was that convenience, or was that situational kind of awareness thing?
No. I went down there because it's a long story, but I basically moved down there just to be a foreign reporter. I always wanted to be a foreign reporter. That was long before I wrote any of these books. I really, when I spent 10 years in Mexico. In fact, people know me for these two books about the drug epidemic, but really my first two books were about Mexico, and they're on Amazon. You can see them there. Yep. And so I really wrote mostly though about immigration. Immigration from Mexico to the United States was a far bigger, more important story than the drug story was at that time. It later became much more severe, much more sadistic, and we're living with the consequences the last 20 years. But at the time I was in Mexico, it really was not the big story. The really big story was the huge waves of migrants, illegal migrants, coming to the United States to work in agriculture, housing, healthcare. I mean, it just on and on and on, all across factory work, all that kind of stuff. So, but I would say this. My knowledge of Mexico was pivotal, was crucial in understanding the Mexican side of this story. In each book, both the Dreamland book and The Least of Us have this Mexico connection because the drug issue is binational, it's symbiotic, and it involves the United States, it involves Mexico. You can't understand it without understanding both. And many reporters, I think, who try to cover the drug problems in the United States do so without much knowledge of Mexico or understanding of what's going on in Mexico. And
that's why I asked the question.
To do that.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question, because I thought there's a level of insight, obviously, clearly, in your first two books, you're right, were about Mexico. So you have an incredibly important backdrop that informs the way you see. And I think that's all about perspectives. And the old argument is, what do you see? The question that comes back from that is, what are you looking at? And, of course, the question from that is, where are you standing? Because where you stand determines what you look at. What you look at determines what you see. Now, you have to shift perspective to get a full understanding. And the paradigmatic shift that I think the Mexican space does. And there's been a lot of movies come out recently about, the Mexican, and again, Hollywoodized and all that sort of thing. But, of course, there's a lot of online services or online platforms that deal with the cartel activity. It's pretty savage and what goes on and what has been going on. And, of course, Of course, yeah, exactly. And of course, the entanglement of people trafficking, human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, they're all intertwined, and we do a lot of seminars in that space around that. But yeah, so that's interesting because that adds to the next question I wanted to ask you about the ecology of addiction. I think that's a term that's not common. I think you alluded to it. I think it was really good. Now, before it's a term that we lean into at the Delgado Institute because an ecology represents, as you've just sort of indicated, a deeper and broader understanding of what this thing is. In a past life, and we're talking many decades ago, I used to be a forest officer in Australia. I used to manage fire in the forest, and fire has its own ecology. It is living, it's breathing, it consumes, it must feed. It has to feed. And you've got to starve fire to shift the ecology of fire. And it's interesting that when I saw that term sort of bandied around, I smiled because I've seen the contagion, if you like, that fire brings, and it does do that, and what drug use is doing. Look, help. I suppose the question I want to ask you is, help the uninitiated. Obviously, I'm a little bit aware of this myself, and some of our listeners will be. How did you, again, using the layered story pathos principle, how did you find that ecology dynamic working its way into your book and out in your book? How did you find that operating in your context?
Well, I'm not sure how exactly you mean ecology of addiction. I would say that I began to put together the connections between several layers of American life that I think were important in this. One is our addictive economy already.
Yeah.
We have an addictive legal economy. You mentioned marijuana. We have hyperpotent marijuana that is sold as if it's fine. I think it's an outrage. I think it's the next problem we're going to face.
It's going to be the next problem, absolutely.
Yeah. We also have many products that are absolutely legal, but which corporations have fine-tuned to be addictive or more addictive than they already are. Gambling apps are the latest one. They're just like, they're roaches. They're like locusts everywhere you go.
Yep.
Gambling this, gambling that, gambling on the next basketball, whether the guy makes his next free throw, that kind of thing. And then you have fast food, junk food, which is a terrible, pernicious influence on our country. Yep. You have social media on smartphones. You could go on and on about that. And so I felt that there was these layers that were beneath the drug addiction layer, which really made us a fertile terrain for drug addiction. Below that, though, is something you mentioned earlier, which was simply the isolation of American life and society, which did not exist when I was growing up, I have to say. People were outside all the time. When I was growing up, I lived on a street, working class to middle class street in Southern California near Los Angeles, and every afternoon, nobody was indoors. Everybody was outside, and unless it was pouring rain, people were outside, and the park was mobbed, and it was, you go to that same street, which I've been back to many a time, and there's nobody outside. The park is empty. And there's this, part of it is economic devastation in certain areas, job loss, and that's part of the story. Another part, it's prosperity. It's the common denominator, though, always is isolation, that we have this, and addiction feed. Heroin lives on our feeds on our isolation.
Beautiful statement. Yeah.
Feed on that. And so to me, there was all these connections. Once you're writing about pain pills first, then heroin, now fentanyl and methamphetamine together, you are really writing about America. That's kind of how I viewed it. I did not want to write about just drugs.
No.
Right? I wanted to write about these deeper weavings of all these societal forces that I think are so important to the stories, the things that are going on today, and also to our own problems of depression, anxiety, a variety of things like that. And it's just people living far too isolated, sometimes because they are so well off. Enormous mansions where 3 people live, in a street with 10 neighbors, but you never go outside, so you never know them, and this kind of thing. And it's really a transformation of American life that was not the case in the middle class to working class neighborhood where I grew up in Southern California. And I think many, many, many people echo this. This is not just me. This is all across the country, and we just lost the bulwark of connectivity. In large part, I think many places because we got so prosperous, frankly. It's a reflection of the prosperity of the country sometimes.
Yeah, I think, right. Prosperity and individualism are a very bad
It's an individualism, though, that, there was a very famous commentator on American life, French fellow back in the 1830s, de Tocqueville, who wrote that American individualism and self-reliance is a wonderful trait of the country. It becomes toxic. He predicted this. It's amazing. 1835, I think the guy was writing. When it becomes isolation, when everyone thinks they don't need everybody else, self-reliance is a very, very solid virtue, and a community is sustaining virtue. When it becomes isolation and everyone suspicious of everybody else and nobody knowing each other, that's when it becomes toxic. And that is frequently what we're living through in the United States.
That's exactly right. And the rabid individualism, the prosperity, the I don't need anyone else, or I'm suspicious of others, creates that isolation. Yeah. It's interesting. When we're doing seminars in public squares, over schools and sporting clubs and whatnot, we talk about the four categories of substance use engagement. Obviously, the first one is relentless pain. We call it relentless pain. That's an obvious one. People want to medicate. Second one is relational poverty, and that's a really powerful one. When people are not connected. They're not connected in sustainable, meaningful, non-sexual intimacy is really, really important. And when that's missing, because we're social animals, we talk about the ecology of drug use. We're talking about the perversion or the counterfeit of the ecology of the human animal. It's like, how do we live best? How do we function best? How do we thrive? You start separating out the human person from the things that help them thrive, and including your self-reliance and resiliency and all the things we actually promote quite heavily here. But if you take that away from a meaningful relationship with others, accountability, serving of others, being others focused, when that disappears from your ecology, then all of a sudden other aspects of your life begin to become unraveled. Now, drug use, substance use is a maelstrom. But it's also a symptom of a bigger problem. We all know that. And unfortunately, it creates such an incredible maelstrom that it has to be engaged. And so people are fighting. It's like, we like Tornado, that Twister movie, tornado chasers. They're trying to figure out how to manage this tornado, where we've got to actually get underneath it and go, well, actually, what's generating this? What's causing this? And how do we negate that so it doesn't happen? And again, the fundamentals that are eroded in the culture, and we've seen it across the world, the Western world, it's become more and more relationally isolated. And of course, the other one is recalcitrant hedonism. That's the other one we use. And of course, the last one is residing absurdity, the disconnection from genuine purpose and meaning, create a real problem. And of course, the wealthy can have it. Also, the incredibly poor can have it. So it's interesting to watch that perfect storm evolve, and then substance use be introduced as the panacea of that ill, whatever that ill may be. Now, when it comes to, obviously, in your journey of discovery, you would have found that even in areas of significant substance uptake, and there was a lot of areas you went to where it was like you said, entire towns were kind of subsumed by this thing. But you would have noticed that there were people, individuals, families, or even groups that didn't get caught up in this nightmare epidemic. If that's the case, if you did bump into those, what cultural, or we'll use the word ecological, antagonists were in play that aided this avoidance? And what were the protective factors that you saw?
Oh, well, I think I have to say, I would say for many people in some communities, it was luck. Their son didn't play football. This is American football.
Yeah, I understand.
Which is basically you probably know, but it's a pretty violent sport that creates enormous amounts of pain, injuries, and so on. And kids, that was one of the gateways to heroin addiction, was football. So if you didn't have a kid who played football, then maybe you could escape it. I was struck by how often it was like, there's no rhyme or reason.
Okay.
This guy went to the doctor to get his dentist to get his wisdom teeth out, and the doctor gave him all these pills, and 2 years later he was dead from a heroin addiction that had advanced after the pill addiction. And
of course.
My feeling is that there was a lot, and the more the pills, to me, this was, I have to say this, both of these stories, the Dreamland story and the Least of Us story, are about supply creating demand.
Yes.
This is not about demand saying, yes, I would love these pills. It was pushing the pills prescribed in greater numbers every year for 20 years nationwide, because it was doctors who were pushed, cajoled, browbeaten, pressured into prescribing these pills
bribed
as the panacea, right? And so you had these pills just prescribed and by huge quantities, more every year, and it just covered the country, and we created an entirely new population of opioid addicted Americans that did not exist before all this. In fact, opioid addiction was really on the severe decline. No new people were becoming heroin. Very few new people were becoming heroin addicts. It was all the old folks who kind of survived on heroin for the last 20, 30 years, since the 1970s when the drug was popular. And we created a vast new population of opioid addicted Americans coast to coast in communities that never had this problem before. And it was really because the supplies were unrelenting, constant, and a lot of the pills that were prescribed ended up in the black market. So kids went to parties and they were taking these pills. They get addicted that way. Many, many ways for people to get addicted, right? And to me, that is one of the ways in which my thinking has radically changed on the drug addiction issue. I believe when I lived in Mexico would always excuse the fact that they had all these drug cartels by saying, well, it's the demand for drugs up there in the United States. It's the Americans, the gringos up there, their unsated appetite for dope. And there's just some truth to that. However, I didn't really write much about drugs when I was in Mexico, and I kind of just accepted that as an idea. Okay, fine, without really knowing. But then as I got into this story and then The Least of Us, I came to totally change my mind on that. And I now believe most of this is supply driven. It is, first example is the opioid epidemic with the pain pills, doctors, drug companies pushing and pushing. And it happens because opioids change our brain chemistry in ways that, say, cocaine, marijuana, other drugs just simply don't. More profoundly, more physically, and so on. And then, of course, the Least of Us is about the transformation of the Mexican cartel world, which used to be plant-based, used to sell poppies, grow marijuana, sell cocaine, and then they transitioned to synthetic drugs, fentanyl and methamphetamine, which require no plants. It's all chemical based. But it's still, the story is still about just a staggering quantity of these two drugs flooding into the United States. It's mind-boggling how much of those two drugs are coming in from Mexico. Every time, even though I've been doing this for a lot of years, I'm still stunned by how much they seize. In like one seizure, it's colossal quantities of drugs, and that's just one seizure. There's all kinds of stuff coming through. So to me, it meant that I really felt that the facts I was discovering had to force me to change my mind, that I believe this is mostly supply driven now, supply creating demand, and then demand and supply kind of have the circular.
It creates its own loop. Yep, creates its own feedback loop. And I think and I'm going to tap in on that, because that's exactly what's happening here in our country, and same in your country, with the cannabis issue. It's now been, of course, the idea of normal, the National Organisation for the Reform of Marijuana Laws back in the 90s made it very clear the way we're going to get recreational marijuana legalised is through the medical model. If we can convince people, their own quote, I'm quoting this organisation, right? If we can convince people this is medicine, then we'll open the door, because you've just said it. When you've got a psychotropic toxin traded as a medicine, and then people use it, and we've got a couple of doctors on our reference group, and two of them work in Colorado, right? So ground zero for legalization. And when they have patients coming in with all sorts of ailments directly related to their cannabis use, they'll say, it's my medicine, you can't take my medicine. And so the demand has now been created by this product. And this is medicine. Weed is good for you. And now once you get that medicine in the system, and of course it has addictive and dependency properties, once that's in play, you create your own demand. It's just bang, 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 bang.
Yeah, and I think that's what's going on with cannabis in this country as well. You know, look, there's in my opinion, there's probably good arguments for why marijuana should be legalized, but the question is that's the first question. The second is, what kind of marijuana, what quality of marijuana should be legalized? Are we talking buds that have 40% THC and vapes that have 90% THC? Or are we talking about marijuana that's 7% and 10%? The problem is, in the United States, and I suspect maybe in Australia as well, but certainly in the United States, we turned over the statutes, the legal, writing of the laws to people who were financially interested in selling as much potent marijuana as possible. And so the laws allow for this ghastly potent marijuana to be sold. And of course, these are most of it's, not most, but a significant percentage of it, I'm sure, is ending up with kids whose brains are still developing. Correct. It's very much reminiscent of the opioid. There's four things. The essence of the opioid epidemic in America was the lessons were beware of drugs that are legal, highly potent, widely available, and promoted with unproven claims about their risk-free nature. That is the opioid epidemic, and that is the marijuana thing in the United States anyway. That's exactly what's going on. Marijuana, it's like, we smoked marijuana in the 70s. Right, it was 3% THC back then. It's not 30, 40, up to 90. Yeah. And it's a whole different beast, and we need to proceed cautiously, humbly, that we don't know what we're doing, and we did not. We have not. We've just said, okay, everybody is. I will say this, though. I will say this. In the last election, 3 states voted down marijuana legalization. I think because the states that had come before had overshot the mark by a significant margin, and they needed to be ratcheted back. They have not done that. But other states are saying, Florida, for example, which I thought would pass it, said no.
And the bad actors threw about $20 million at that campaign to try and get it legalized, and they still lost. And that's how much money's behind this. And again, the addiction for profit industry, and this is what staggers me. I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is a rabbit hole we could go down. We're very big on this in our space here. But what's staggering to me is that and you're a student of history. This is one of your majors, right? You're a student of history. We've got big tobacco, 2.0 with big cannabis, but we also got, in between that, we've got the opioid crisis. So it's the same playbook. Let's get a product out there that's addictive. Let's label it as a medicine or potentially beneficial for your health. Let's have it promoted by so-called doctors and or clinicians. And then once we've got that narrative in play, the community buys a narrative that this is going to be okay. And if the government's permitting it, surely it can't be that bad, which is exactly what happened with the opioid thing, as you've just beautifully 100%. Outlined to us. It went bananas, and your books show the devastation of that. And now we've got big marijuana, big tobacco 2.0 doing exactly the same thing. And we're going, oh, hang on, it won't be a problem this time. Sure, big tobacco is a problem. We figured that out after 70 years. Yes, opioids, they were a problem. We figured that out after 20 years. But marijuana, that won't be a problem. No, that won't. We'll be okay with this.
That's already a problem. Many problems with it, psychotic events. Really, it's addictive in ways that people won't recognize, even though maybe not in the same way that opioids are addictive.
Of course, it's a different animal.
And a lot of it, of course, also, it's so important. Again, it's all about supply. You have enormous amounts of it. It's very potent. Kids, and anybody really, but kids particularly, will get dragged down into it, and their lives will really never be the same. They'll pass up opportunities. They'll, the languishing kind of approach to life that so many marijuana users get into. It's, to me, very, very scary. So to me, it's a reflection again of this enormous economic powers that are pushing highly addictive products that are now, in this case, we're talking about legal products, of course, that in America, and I can't speak for Australia, nor can I speak for other countries in the world, but I know in America, we have allowed those people great leeway to do whatever, to advertise as if their drugs are literally, as if their products are literally like legal drugs that if you're craving them, that's a good thing. Well, any addict knows that cravings are torments. They are not a good thing, but you see fast food restaurants and stuff like this craving our tacos, craving our burgers, or that kind of stuff. It's a perversion. It's capitalism run amok. It's a perfect example of where the private sector has just taken it and the public sector has allowed them, and they just ran far. They've taken that leash way beyond where they should have been allowed to take it.
Exactly. No, it's spot on. And look, it is happening here. We don't have the same. America's got this freedom of speech dynamic that enables, once it's put on the table as being okay, then you're able to advertise, carte blanche. We can't do that in this country. That's one thing Australia's got. We've got a strong hold on. Now, Americans might say we lack freedom of speech, which we do in other areas, but I won't go down that rabbit hole either. But it is, we don't have that rabid commercialization engine behind like the substance of cannabis. But it's interesting in this. I'll leave this. I'll end with this little anecdote before we go to the next question. But there was a Western Australian government here. When they saw that medical cannabis was given a free pass by our TGA, which is your FDA, right? It's called a TGA, Therapeutic Goods Administration. They gave a special caveat pass that marijuana could be produced and deployed through clinics without the full clinical trials being done, because the people voted for it, right? Now, the WA government back in 2017-18 set up this great thing. We're going to make a lot of money out of this. It's the great panacea to all ills, because cannabis is not a panacea to any ill. In fact, it cures nothing. It's a symptom alleviation tool at best, but we won't go down that road. But the issue was, of the 10,000+ doctors in that state in 2017-18, none of them would prescribe cannabis for their patients. And the government said to them, why aren't you prescribing this? They said, because the clinical trials aren't good enough. This is too many grey areas. We see some of the faults with this. Yes, there is potential for medical use in this. We saw that with Epidiolex, created by GW Pharma for Dravet syndrome epilepsy. A very small window, and it does alleviate symptoms. It's a fourth-line treatment, yada, yada, yada. It's not the first-line treatment. Anyway, there is potential there. No one's arguing that. But these things were left off the chain, and the government said, you must prescribe to these people if they want it. So the government's now saying, you've got to do this. And the doctors, the medical practitioners said, okay, well, if the government's demanding this, they started prescribing. And of course, guess what happened? Oh, this works. I feel better, but I'm only getting worse. Again, I feel better, but I'm only getting worse. The long-term harms of this are catastrophic. Yeah. But so then you've got supply now, as you've just indicated, supply being pushed, and it creates its own demand. Brilliant, wonderful. Yeah. And we're going to just focus on that in, I think, some of our promotion of this. But look, in a recent article by WRD News, Social Capital and Drug Overdose, How Strong Communities Save Lives in the US, noted that shared values, along with authentic, supportive community and non-sexual intimacy and connection, remains an inextricable part of any healthy human experience. Yeah. But the evaporation of this is seen as a key driver in the mess that you've talked about. Now, we've touched on this.
Yeah, no doubt.
Can you just go a little bit further? Give us some stories. For
sure. I mean, I think what I tried to do in The Least of Us, and then later in a story after that, was to talk about some of these towns that had suffered mightily from this addiction problem, and who are now coming back. Now, these are very small towns. They were towns where major sources of employment had evaporated: coal mines in one case, steel mill and shoe factories in another. But this is happening in many small towns. I just wrote about two of them. And basically, these towns went through horrible decades of addiction to pills and then heroin. And anyway, it's a very well-known tale. But what I found fascinating was that in both of these cases, these towns were coming back not because some big factory or some big shopping mall was coming and saying, I'm going to build my factory with 200 jobs. Any factory comes these days is going to be automated, going to be robots. In America, the cost of labor is too high. No one's going to build 200 jobs for actual humans. That's not going to happen. But what I found fascinating was that was not how they had rebounded, or we're rebounding in the process of rebounding. The way they rebounded was to make life better for people who lived in the towns, creating connections with community, and then that allowed people to say, I want to be part of this town. I want to, and their business ideas. Small business, actually small doesn't even describe it. It's more like micro entrepreneurial ideas of how to create businesses. And so you'd have businesses created with like 2 employees or something like that. But you got this synergy that began to happen when more and more and more people began to do that. See, oh, he did it, maybe I could try too. And then the city gets involved and reforms and becomes a modern governing city. Now, a lot of these towns had horrible city governments because they were just so devastated by all the problems, job loss and addiction. And so what you find is it's very exciting, and I love telling you stories. It's a beautiful American story of resilience and rebound, of people starting these little things, and little by little by little, the connectivity is restored.
Beautiful.
That was there, was shredded, and is restored because more and more people are getting to know each other, and they're all of like mind. They're all like, hey, let's move forward. No more of this getting obese and sitting around doing dope and stealing the manhole covers to sell for money for dope and all that stuff. Let's do working out. Let's start our own businesses. And you begin to see this. And part of the beauty of this too is that many of the people involved, the business owners, but also the employees, are addicts in recovery from drug addiction. Yes. They are, a recovering addict, I've always thought, is like a new fossil fuel. It's a new natural resource. It's a person who is left behind stealing the manhole covers and is now looking for ways to be creative, brings optimism, gratitude, of course, huge, and willingness to work with other people, all of which is the opposite of how they behaved when they were addicts, right? Yeah. And so they bring this new energy to the small town, and that is what you're seeing too in a lot of these towns. A lot of people 30 years after this whole thing, 40 years after this whole thing, 30 years after this whole thing began, people are coming out and returning, those who survived, because a lot of people did not, and a lot of people are in prison and all the rest. But those who survived are like saying, I can. And so it's a beautiful story, but it's exactly what you're talking about. It's like that, establishing the links that were torn asunder, establishing the connections and the meeting of the minds. And one thing that's very interesting in all this is that essential to all this, I don't know what life is like in Australia, but I'm going to assume that you guys have lots of cafes, like Starbucks kind of model, but independent. In the United States, the independent cafe is the barometer of economic vitality. The more of them you have, it's likely you have a more vibrant economy. And in each of these towns, you begin to see these cafes. Small stuff, it's all small. It's not making the evening news or anything like this. Yeah. But what's beautiful about it is you see these people recovering, coming up out of the ground again, flowering, flourishing, but not because Walmart built a big store in town. It's more like, well, this woman opened a women's clothing boutique in an old restaurant. There used to be a restaurant 25 years ago and it was been empty for 20 years, And this guy started a toy shop, and this guy is an independent cafe. It's this small stuff, and that's really what I was getting at with the title of the book, The Least of Us.
Beautiful.
It's about, it's a biblical reference. It's about what you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me, for Jesus, through his disciples in Matthew. But it's also the smallest effort is actually the most important. That small little store that has one employee or two employees can actually give rise to something where everyone sees, oh, I could do this too. And so I was really trying to write about us as a culture, getting away from the big, sexy, magic answer and getting back to the small community development approach to finding each other, developing connections with each other of people of like mind, and then from that, economic development, jobs, creation, and also a community that is optimistic and not fatalistic.
Perfect. And I think that's there again. You find, we talked before about the residing absurdity as being part of that issue, and that's that whole numbing out. Like everything's pointless, it's worthless, it's useless, let's just do it.
Yeah.
And we become the least. We actually self-sabotage to the point where we are completely dehumanized by this substance. And that's the very nature of the animal, the ecology of drug use. But what you said, I love that new fossil fuel, because we work very closely with the recovery alumni. And my next question was going to be about that, but you've already opened that door. So I'm really grateful for that. Is that, again, lived and living experience are very powerful resources if they are harnessed well, not just storytelling, horror story revisiting. It's about, and we found that we did something at the UN in Vienna this year. We talked about both sides of prevention and recovery. In fact, they're the same page. It's almost exactly the same factors, maybe retasked, reworked a little bit in different contexts, but they are the same principles for recovery as they are for prevention. So we have basically, we say there's two basic bookends is prevention and there's recovery. In between is drug use. In between is this insanity so the idea is to try and close that gap to the point where and all of a sudden, hang on a minute, I don't need to step into substance use because of recalcitrant hedonism or residing absurdity or relentless pain or relational poverty.
No, I think all this is so important. It's understanding what happens when we turn our backs on that communal aspect of life. You know, the truth is that human beings are the most prosperous mammal on the face of the earth because of that need for community. Yep. That real desire. It's not like a nice thing. It's an essential thing.
Absolutely.
The problem is, and I can only speak for the United States. In the United States, we got away from that. We decided, we're so proud. We don't need this. We don't need that. We don't need this guy. I don't like him because he's not my religion, or he votes he votes in a different way, and I can't stand the way he votes, and all this kind of stuff. And we thought we could do that, except for when you do that, you have enormously devastating consequences, and we're living it in the last 30 years. One symptom of that is this whole drug addiction epidemic. Obviously, along with that come these extraordinarily potent economic forces able to take advantage of that. First, the drug companies, pharmaceutical companies in America, that's one. And then lately, the Mexican trafficking cartels down on the western side of Mexico, Sinaloa, Michoacan, Guerrero, Nayarit, all these states down there on the western coast, who now are importing precursor chemicals, ingredients to make fentanyl and methamphetamine from China.
Yes, of course. China's the source, and the segue is Mexico. Yep.
Well, in Mexico, what's different about probably every other country in the world, I'm not sure this is the case, but I think it is, that almost every other, let's call it first world developed country in the world does not live next to a country that was once the third world. Except for the United States, we have Mexico. Now, Mexico is, I would say, well on its way to developing beyond the third world. However, in that period, though, I'm talking the beginning in the 60s, really, but ramping up in the 70s and certainly in the 80s, the Mexican trafficking culture, and I've written a lot about this, really expanded. It saw, it grew marijuana and heroin poppies and all that, but it also learned to traffic cross the border with dope, And so we have today on our flank an extraordinarily sophisticated trafficking culture, entrepreneurial trafficking culture in Mexico, only a few hundred miles from south of the border of Arizona and Texas, California, and so on. Excuse me. And so all of that means that those guys are not going to go back to raising cows, you know? They're not going to go back to grazing cucumbers, and which is how a lot of them started, and corn and chile and all that. They are going to continue to look for new sources of illegal, because there's no way that legal work is going to make them kind of money that they are now very, very used to.
And that's its own addiction there,
extraordinarily
right there.
Sophisticated trafficking culture right on the flank, and that means that our enormous economy, it will most likely have this problem for some time. On top of that, I think it's important to understand too, the world may be puzzled at our gun laws in the United States. I can understand the puzzlement. But a lot of the assault military grade weapons that we allow to be sold to almost any 18-year-old in this country, apparently, a lot of those get smuggled south to Mexico.
Yeah.
And that ensures the impunity in Mexico of the very people who are making now fentanyl and methamphetamine that are absolutely killing Americans all across the country.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. CNN did an article about 7 or 8 years ago about they actually went after cocaine a little bit. The comment was, a couple of hits of cocaine in New York will pay for an AR-15, which is the preferred assault weapon of the Sicario. So that was interesting. That AR-15s for $700. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah, we can't get assault rifles here. They were banned after Port Arthur massacred many decades ago. We got rid of all our automatic weapons. Gun sales in Australia are huge.
Good move.
But
I have covered personally as a reporter. I have covered seven as a reporter, as a daily newspaper reporter. I have covered 7 mass murders. Six of them. One was with a car on a train track, but 6 of them were with assault weapons of the kind your AR-15s, AK-47s. I mean, it's an insanity that the rest of the world is right to wonder at. I don't understand.
We do wonder. I get it. But yeah, look, I think that's I think that this, and again, before I made that comment before about there's another addiction level here when coca farmers in Colombia, they get addicted to prosperity as well. Now, we want to get out of poverty. Everyone wants to get out of poverty. I understand that. Yeah. But when we step out of that space with illegitimate means, we create another layer of poverty in our community, as we've just talked about, the huge poverty that this drug epidemic has brought. But the addiction to an income, a level of income, is also problematic. The ability to go, and the least of us saying, you know what, I can rise above this without becoming part of the problem. And of course, in Mexico, when you get kids, they're mules. They get, look here, here's $1,000. Mule this dope here. If you get done, you get done. Bad luck. You're a kid. So they're using children. It's just horrendous what goes on. But again, that addiction to this kind of lifestyle that's been obviously exported by the United States and by Europe to a certain extent, of that you can have it all. It's important. Now, this is the life. Luxury, excitement, privilege. These are what we aspire to, and that aspirational. Oh,
absolutely. You see this very, very strongly. You see this very, very strongly in the Mexican drug world. That people start out dirt poor, and they say, I want to sell some dope, or I want to do this work or help move these drugs from here to there, or package them or whatever. And when I do, I'm going to buy myself a taxi cab, and that'll be the way I make my money. Yeah. Or I'm going to buy myself a little shop, and then my wife will run it, and that kind of thing. And the truth is, though, that does happen, but it's more often is that people get addicted to the money. It's just as much an addictive substance as some of these other things we mentioned. And what they also get addicted to in Mexico, this is absolutely the case, they get addicted to being the big guy, the big man who's on the plaza. I remember one guy I talked to, for the least of us, one of the greatest moments of his life was when he was after selling heroin in Arizona and New Mexico and states in the United States. Mm-hmm. He came back home to his village, had $15,000 in his pocket, 15, never seen that much money remotely in his life. And he was the first one from his little village to go to the bigger town nearby and pay for the beer for everybody, all his newfound friends. And the plaza all night long. So they sang and they listened to, they had bands play music for him. And this guy bought the beer and bought the rum and all that stuff. And he refers to that as one of the greatest moments in his life. Now, none of that's possible without dope money, you know, but it's like this feeling like I am somebody. And you get addicted. You get addicted to the feeling like you are somebody. And this is, when you come from very poor surroundings, this is a narcotic.
Yes, it is.
Very much just like the drugs you are selling. And I saw so many guys get caught up in that. They had this idea: I'm going to buy a house, or I'm going to buy some land where I can build a house, or I'm going to buy a new used truck, and that's it. And it never was enough. They always had to go back and back and back, and then they got arrested, put them in prison for several years. You know, it was never. They never found a time when it was enough.
No, and that's a fascinating phenomenon. That's where you start moving into what we talked about earlier. We won't get in that road again, but the whole idea of purpose, of meaning, of significance. Where do we derive those things from? Where do they come from? And what is sustainable? And certainly if it's materialism that becomes our ultimate driver, then it's never enough. It's insatiable. And that's one of the difficulties.
That's the great lesson of the opioid epidemic, which is you cannot be happy, be fulfilled, find that purpose from something, a product that you are being sold, that you buy.
Correct.
It is something that it goes deep within us. I will tell you, this is weird. I'll send you guys the cover to my next book.
Sure.
The next book has to do exactly with this topic you just brought up, Shane. I wanted, after 2 books writing about these very grim topics, even as hopeful as some parts were, it was tough. And so I wanted to write about something very, very different. I wanted to write about people who were not looking to buy happiness from something they purchased.
Correct.
But rather from something they created from within, that they used, that they worked hard to develop their own capacity, their own capabilities, and through that develop this kind of purpose, and they loved this. And so I wrote a book. It's coming out in September, and I'll send you the cover. You can put it up on your site if you want, along with the others. It's about the tuba, the marching band tuba, right?
Yeah, I know the tuba. Yeah. I get it. Yep.
Why? Because it's about people. I got onto this because I realized it was about people who were with no expectation of money, no expectation of fame, were doing something because they loved it, because it showed them what they were capable of, because it allowed them to work together with other people towards a larger goal. It's a very opposite of addiction. Tuba playing is the very opposite of addiction. It's this way of saying, and it's hard. You got to push through failure constantly. You got to be persistent, postpone gratification. You got to develop this gorgeous, beautiful, precious column of air. With addiction, as you know, opioid addiction is about shutting down the lungs. That's how you die. The brain stops telling the lungs to breathe. That precious column of air is shut down. But with tuba playing, it's like this. You develop it, and your lungs become big, and you're able to fill that enormous beast of a horn with air, and and then you make this sound. The sound of a tuba playing starts with this kind of buzzing, wet buzzing against metal, your lips in the metal, blah, 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 like that. And it comes out, all these tubes, and then it comes out the bell, and boom, it can just rock the room. It's like life. It's like the more you work at it, you fail, you don't sound good, you look bad, and then all of a sudden you're able to create this enormous, beautiful sound. And so it's a very weird idea, but I wrote this book about tuba players because I wanted to write about people who were finding the fulfillment, the purpose, as you say, from something that they had to work hard to achieve, not buy.
Yeah, exactly.
And to me, that is a radical idea, certainly in America today. Yeah. You know, everything should be easy. Everything should be easy. And why would you do something that didn't pay and all the other kind of crap? And the tuba it became a gorgeous story. And I really wrote it because I wanted to do something very different. I didn't want to write anything about drug addiction. And then it turned out that it returned. It came right back.
It goes back
to the topic
because you're
again.
dealing with source, origin, symptom, and then you're dealing with the aspects that actually prevent that. Our world, we created a space called the World Resiliency Week. It's coming out into June. Actually, I might promote that particular book on that platform.
Feel free.
Because I think we have various actors from lots of different disciplines across the world involved, young, old, middle age. We call it 50. If you're 15 or 55, you need to build resiliency. And what's that look like?
Yeah.
Resilient people, and the resilient people are their persistence of will. They've got the problem-solving skills, but they're founded on hope. And I think that's one of the issues that a lot of people have lost sight of, is hope, because they again, what you said, they want the quick fix, they want the counterfeit, they want the easy buy. They don't want to understand that labor and creation are not liabilities. They're not liabilities.
That's a great point.
They are incredible assets, and they're wonderful assets. And once they're properly engaged, you do get significance, because you are building. You're not building an empire that everyone's going to notice and go, "Hey, look at that guy! He's going to shout everyone beers." You're saying, "Wow, I'm actually deeply satisfied because I am creating that which is significant for me, and this matters. It matters."
But you know, that's what these little towns that I was talking about just a minute ago are about. It's not hope, kind of some vain kind of wonder if some of the things are going to get better. It's hope based on actual labor,
correct,
and creation and collaboration, and that's kind of what tuba players, marching band players are like that in the United States. It seems to me it's very much like that, where you are developing something together with other people. That's where true powerful hope comes from. And I think you put your finger on it right there. It's the labor, it's the working at it, and not feeling like that's normal. That's a good thing. Not that, oh gee, do I have to work? Oh no, I want to sit back and watch and doom scroll through my social media feeds for the next 3 hours. Yeah. No, it's absolutely what you said, which is that it's through work, through collaboration, especially with other people, finding that common interest, those common bonds that we have shredded in America anyway. We have shredded long ago, I think, and very, very detrimental to our own well-being. And then you get people basing future plans, on hope, but it's realistic.
Yeah, well,
it's not like dreamy kind of hallucinogenic hope.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, when we talk about hope, there's an acrostic around hope. We've written quite extensively on this because it's part of our resiliency platform. But hope is not just the positive expectation of good. That's the dreamy, maybe it'll work. It's the reasonable grounds for it. So the question we always ask, have you got positive expectation of good? Great. What are the reasonable grounds? Because I know I've got connection with this person. We're working on this project. We have a purpose. We're not after the dollar. We're not after the bottom line. We're not after the thing. We're after creating. And because I can collaborate, because I have a sense of purpose, I have an identity that's tied up in I'm creating something with others. That's the hope. That's
excellent point.
That's the positive expectation of good and the reasonable grounds for it. And so one of the things when we talk to kids and families, as a matter of fact, and the guys that you're dealing with who are creating these social capital environments, very powerful ones, have all understood that hope looks like. They understand the reasonable grounds isn't that the end product. It isn't that pill. It isn't that event. It isn't that feeling. It isn't that moment. It is a ongoing, synergistic, absolute vulnerable collaboration with others as part of that big deal. And they're working for something bigger than themselves. And I think that's a key issue.
Totally.
I was going to ask you
I think that's the main issue here. It's you're right. It's not that dreamy kind of hope. It's finding real reasons to understand that things might get a little bit better. Not huge. I think we really need to get away from the idea like
triumphalism.
Everything's going to be answered tomorrow. No, that's not the way human beings have ever worked, ever moved forward. It's always the small step, and sometimes it seems so inconsequential. But it's getting to the point that you were making. I think is a very, very good one, which is it's that reasonable basis for what you can expect in the future is based on those little steps forward they are crucial. You don't have that. You don't have anything, And so I think that in some areas in the United States that were mightily hit by this problem, you are seeing that. You are seeing exact examples of that. And I think that's extraordinarily, that's thrilling. It's exhilarating, and it gets away from the inertia and the fatalism that is so much associated with drug addiction.
Yeah, the neo-nihilism that's emerged in our culture from the most prosperous and whatever. I was going to ask you one more question about the evolution of opioids. I'm not going to do that because I think we want to end on something really, really positive. And what we've just talked about is really, really important. And I think we have a platform that we developed called the Humpty Dumpty Dilemma project. And the nursery rhyme is powerful, right? And I think this is... it's an inventory. We've shared this in a number of different spaces, and I'm going to share it here again. But the nursery rhyme is an inventory, and it's probably more relevant today than it's ever been in its 500-year history. But Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Question number one, why is this generation so fragile? What's created this fragility? Where did this come from, particularly in the First World West with all our potential? Secondly, what's a fragile individual doing in a precarious, dangerous place? Was he coaxed up there, lured up there, coerced up there? Did he fall or was he pushed? Right? That's a very important distinction. Okay, what's going on there? And then thirdly, why can't governments fix this? And fourthly, is where do kings go to find answers? And this is the key issue. You've got to look at what you're seeing with social capital. People are going back to roots, and they're going back to the fundamentals of the human existence. Belief in something bigger than themselves, a purpose that they can invest in, the care for and investment in others, and allowing them to care for and invest in you, and then building something together. And these are the things that are happening. And look, I love this conversation. We've gone way over an hour here, mate, and I'm sorry to keep you for so long, but it's been really, really great. Please send through those bits and pieces. And for our listeners, look, we want to, we're going to try and craft this up so get all the salient points in for you guys. Sam Quinones, It's been absolutely wonderful having you on. Your insights, your works are fabulous, but obviously chatting to you as an author, and we're looking forward to this new book too. And please send us through some of your details on that.
Oh yeah, you're all down for 5 copies. It's called the Perfect Tuba. No, Shane, it's been great talking with you, man. And I so appreciate your interest in my work and in these topics, which has been part of my life for the last 15 years or something like that. And hello to everybody in Australia. Someday I'd love to visit Australia. I'd love to see what that country is all about. I have not been able to get out there yet.
No, make sure you put it on your bucket list, my friend, and do it, because we've had a few from the States come out. Again, Sam Quinones, thank you so much for being with us. It's been fabulous. And for our listeners here, thanks for chiming in again. Looking forward to seeing you next time on the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until then, find hope and invest in it. Okay, till then, bye.
As we wrap up today's session, remember, each step towards understanding is a step away from unnecessary harm. We're here to empower, inspire, and pave the way for optimal well-being. Stay resilient, stay informed, and continue being the change your community needs. Thank you for joining us at the Unnecessary Harm podcast. Until next time, take care and keep pushing forward.